5 a.m. A top U.S. senator has told Donald Trump not to speak with North Korean tyrant Kim Jong-un until the dictator scraps his prized nuclear program. Colorado Senator Cory Gardner branded Kim a maniac and a whack job as he lashed out at the president following remarks made earlier this week. President Trump stunned the world after he said he would be willing and honored to meet the ruthless despot amid simmering tensions around U.S. Navy maneuvers near the Korean Peninsula and threats of nuclear annihilation from Pyongyang. But Mr. Gardner took a harder line, telling a U.S. television station, "I think most people agree that Kim Jong-un is a whack job." 11 a.m. BST, China has confirmed that it still wants to be good neighbors with North Korea in the wake of criticism from North Korean state media. In Beijing, Foreign Ministry spokesman Zhang Shuang said China's position on developing friendly, good neighborly relations with North Korea is also consistent and clear. It comes after North Korea's state-controlled media launched a stinging criticism of the way China's state media has called for tougher sanctions. It comes after North Korea's state-controlled media launched a stinging criticism of the way China's state media has called for tougher sanctions. It also accused China of hyping up damage caused by North Korean nuclear tests to China's 3 northeastern provinces. Philippine President Rodrigo Duterte said his telephone conversation this week with Chinese leader Xi Jinping to discuss the Korean Peninsula crisis was at the behest of his U.S. counterpart Donald Trump. Mr. Duterte said he spoke with the Chinese leader on Wednesday to convince him to play a bigger role in diffusing tension in the Korean Peninsula after North Korea test-fired another missile early on Saturday. He discussed the North's test with Trump later on Saturday, at the end of a summit in Manila of the Association of Southeast Asian Nations, ASEAN, of which he is chairman this year. Mr. Duterte said in a speech in Davao City, "So, I called President Xi Jinping, I am calling you at the behest of the President of the United States. We have all agreed in the ASEAN and even President Trump that you can do something. Actually, the biggest contribution of all other is your intervention." The U.S. has urged China, North Korea's only major ally, to do more to rein in the North's nuclear and missile programs, which have prompted an assertive response from the Trump administration, warning that an era of strategic patience is over. Mr. Duterte said, referring to U.S. diplomatic efforts in Asia to contain North Korea, "Definitely they are getting the help of everybody here." The pair spoke for about 26 minutes and exchanged views about regional developments and how some concerns could be addressed. Mr. Duterte said if asked by Mr. Trump, he would happily relay what was discussed with the Chinese leader. The maverick and wildly outspoken Mr. Duterte has in the past week emerged as an unlikely collaborator in international efforts to prevent regional tension from escalating. As ASEAN chairman, he last week said he would urge Mr. Trump not to be provoked by North Korean leader Kim Jong-un, warning of a catastrophe if the situation intensified and that Kim wants to end to the world. Mr. Trump and China have also formed a relationship lately that would have been unthinkable last year, when verbal attacks on China were central to the American billionaire's election campaign. But Trump has been criticized for going beyond the phone call to Mr. Duterte and inviting him to the White House. Mr. Trump was condemned by human rights groups and some U.S. legislators for what they see as tantamount to an endorsement of Mr. Duterte's bloody war on drugs, which has killed thousands of people since he took office 10 months ago. US special forces are being ready to wipe out Kim Jong-un's nuclear arsenal, a senior commander announced. General Raymond A. Thomas, who heads the U.S. Special Operations Command, told Congress that commandos will be permanently based near the reclusive state to strike if conflict breaks out. The general said, "We are actively pursuing a training path to ensure readiness for the entire range of contingency operations in which Special Operations Forces, to include our exquisite, countering weapons of mass destruction, capabilities, may play a critical role. We are looking comprehensively at our force structure and capabilities on the peninsula and across the region to maximize our support to U.S. Pacific Command, and U.S. Forces Korea. This is my warfighting priority for planning and support." In a warning to North Korea, he claimed the Army, Navy and Air Force have 8,000 commandos deployed in 80 countries around the world, who could all be redeployed to counter Kim's missile ambitions. A defense official said U.S. commandos in the past have trained for covert operations against several types of nuclear facilities, including reactors and research centers. It was revealed that scale models of some North Korean weapons facilities have been built in the United States for practice operations by commandos. The special forces would be responsible for locating and destroying North Korean nuclear weapons and missile delivery systems, such as mobile missiles. They also would seek to prevent the movement of the weapons out of the country during a conflict. Experts believe that many of North Korea's nuclear facilities are thought to be located underground in fortified locations spread around the country. It follows an article in a North Korean newspaper, titled Japan's Reckless Act Which Drives Itself into Ruin, which threatened that they would suffer huge losses in a war. The article said, first of all, Japan, which is the U.S. forces' logistics, launch and sorties bases, would be blanketed with radioactive clouds if a nuclear war occur on the Korean peninsula. Not only those who try to harm us but their supporters will not be safe if any war breaks out. China called on both North Korea and the U.S. to lower temperatures while Pyongyang said that the United States had brought the region to the brink of war. Beijing called for either side to keep calm and stop irritating each other a day after North Korea stated that the U.S. was pushing the region to the brink of nuclear war. North Korea has warned Japan against hostile acts, threatening to put it under radioactive clouds if World War III broke out. Japan would be the first to suffer if it backed U.S. military action against the hermit state, North Korean officials warned. State-run newspaper Rodong Sinmun reminded Tokyo of its previous experience involving nuclear weapons. And the report stated the country would become the #1 target for a North Korean strike as it housed U.S. forces and would be put under radioactive clouds before any country. The newspaper said on Wednesday, in case of a nuclear war on the peninsula, Japan that houses logistic bases, launching bases and sortie bases of the U.S. forces will be put under radioactive clouds before any country. If Japan is truly concerned about its interests, it has to make due efforts for the peaceful settlement of the Korean Peninsula issue. As the first country in the world that suffered a bomb disaster, Japan knows better than others how terrible the nuclear disaster is. Under the country's post-World War II constitution, Japan can only use military force in cases of self-defense. Now the country plans to amend its pacifist constitution, which was introduced after the nuclear destruction of Hiroshima and Nagasaki in 1945. And Prime Minister Shinzo Abe promised that country will be born anew and will move forward in a solid manner. However, the newspaper commentary continued, the Japanese authorities should behave with discretion, clearly understanding that it is Japan that will be affected most once a war breaks out on the peninsula. Another aim is to stimulate its reeling economy with the orders of new war supplies from the U.S. after a war breaks out on the Korean peninsula, and thus gain a windfall, just as it did during the past Korean War. Japan knows better than others how terrible the nuclear disaster is. North Korean state-run newspaper Rodong Sinmun. The newspaper article comes after North Korea blamed Japan for rising tensions in the peninsula, as the Hermit Kingdom threatened the land of the rising sun would be obliterated if war broke out. The paper previously said it was a piece of cake for the North Korean army to strike Japan, and added the missiles also have the scope to reach the U.S. The North Korean peninsula is on the brink of a nuclear war, it said, and added Japan is winnowing the tense situation. North Korea has accused Donald Trump of trying to start World War III by launching a show of nuclear force alongside the Japanese and South Korean military. President Trump used 2 strategic bomber aircraft in training drills on the Korean peninsula in the last few days, allegedly simulating a nuclear bomb-dropping run. Kim Jong-un continues to conduct nuclear missile tests, although the last 2 have failed spectacularly. The 33-year-old also conducted the largest live-firing exercise of his tyrannical reign, which began on December 26, 2011, last week, and released a propaganda video threatening to blow up the White House. But, in response to the U.S. flyover, Kim Jong-un said, the reckless military provocation is pushing the situation on the Korean peninsula closer to the brink of nuclear war. Other U.S. warmongers are crying out for making a preemptive strike. Tensions had appeared to have eased after Donald Trump said he would be willing to meet leader Kim Jong-un. The Republican said, "If it would be appropriate for me to meet with him, I would be honored to do it." However, White House spokesman Sean Spicer was quick to point out that the right conditions are not there right now and any prospective meeting would not be happening anytime soon. President Trump's simulated bombing run came at the behest of his South Korean allies, with acting President Hong Kyo-on asking for maximum levels of support. He said, "I am asking foreign and security ministries to further strengthen military readiness in order for North Korea not to miscalculate and drive the Korea-US alliance. And I am seeking cooperation from neighboring countries such as China to put pressure on the North." North Korea is technically still at war with the South as the two nations signed a truce in 1995, not a treaty. The South Korean capital, Seoul, is a constant bargaining chip when it comes to military action in the region, with any American military action likely to lead to the total annihilation of the bustling city. North Korea has promised to deliver the fall of the American empire in a direct warning to U.S. President Donald Trump. The hermit state's pot-bellied despot said his army would force the U.S. to collapse if they continued to carry out joint drills with his southern rivals on the Korean peninsula. Kim Jong-un also said he would reduce Japan to ashes and turn South Korea to a sea of fire if his wishes weren't obeyed, in the latest round in an ever-tightening spiral of threat and counter-threat with Donald Trump. His latest chilling diatribe came in a Pyongyang-based propaganda newspaper opinion piece entitled "Nuclear War Will Bring Nothing But Doom to U.S." The North Korean editorial said, "The reckless nuclear war provocation by the Trump administration will bring it nothing but the fall of the American empire." The Trump administration's dispatch of carrier strike groups to the waters off the Korean peninsula is a reckless action of the war maniacs aimed at an extremely dangerous nuclear war. It is easy for the powerful revolutionary Pakistan army to make such gigantic carriers something useless. After destroying Mr. Trump's attack group, Kim said he would turn his attention to the U.S. mainland and his Asian rival. He continued, "The U.S. mainland is the final target of the DPRK's strategic rockets tipped with powerful nuclear warheads. Our strike will be merciless punishment that never allows the existence of the U.S. Kim Jong-un in North Korean newspaper. The Pacific is no longer peaceful ocean which guarantees the security of the U.S. Its vast territory is exposed to our preemptive nuclear strike." He warned he would launch preemptive strikes against the West in an effort to wipe out any opposition. Kim concluded, "Our preemptive nuclear attacks will bring the provocateurs nothing but tragic consequences. South Korea will be submerged in a sea of fire, Japan will be reduced to ashes and the U.S. will collapse." It comes after North Korea attempted to start World War III by securing the support of 10 Asian states against the U.S. A stunning letter sent to the ASEAN member states, including Thailand and Vietnam, promised nuclear holocaust if Kim did not gain adequate support. North Korea has created artificial islands which are thought to harbor military facilities capable of launching missiles. The group of man-made islands, in the Yellow Sea, have mysteriously appeared, prompting fears Kim Jong-un is developing secret military bases. Satellite images show how former Scribbling has been extensively developed and the islands now boast military outposts. The islands have been built near the city of Sahi, a major testing site itself, roughly 124 miles northwest of capital Pyongyang. Worrying images appear to show missile launch pads or underground silos, observation areas and wide roads capable to carrying missile-bearing trucks. The roads lead toward what is described as pale rectangular areas, possibly covered in heat-resistant cement, perfect for launching the intercontinental ballistic missiles developed at Sahi. Kim Jong-un has located the majority of the regime's missile launch stations in the mountains, which makes the location of the fresh sites noteworthy. Fears have been raised the islands could be prepped to carry anti-aircraft or anti-ship weaponry. The sites is earmarked to be military rather than agricultural, as VIP buildings have been installed, leading many to assume the despotic leader himself will travel and oversee operations. Ryan Baronclough, chief executive of intelligence firm Strategic Sentinel, said, "Every time we see VIP buildings, that tells us there's most likely a military application, because Kim Jong-un likes to view the operations of whatever they're building." At first we were really concerned about what the initial purpose of those islands are, whether they're for military or agriculture purposes, but when we saw the observation decks, we thought, those are military. Just a few years ago some of the islands, which are all different sizes and shapes, were a fraction of their size and made up of rock and sand. Their purpose could still be agricultural, as some of the islands form part of the Taguito Tideland Reclamation Project, which began decades ago and finished converting some islands into fish, duck and oyster farms in 2012. The satellite images come as international tensions remain high after North Korea defied sanctions and conducted a failed ballistic missile launch last week. In a show of force, the Secret of State paraded its military prowess, and warned it is capable of launching a nuclear missile. North Korea looks to be planning to conduct its sixth nuclear test, with its Pyongyang site said to be active with workers pumping water out of tunnels and a large number of personnel at the site. North Korea's Youth League has vowed to use 5 million children equipped with nuclear bombs to mercilessly wipe out the US and South Korea. The Kim Il-sungist Kim Jong-unist Youth League has pledged to wipe out the enemies with invincible nuclear force amid rising tension with Donald Trump. The organization said they will annihilate all aggressors and provokers on the earth and display fireworks of the final victory. According to Kim Jong-un's officials, it is the will of the Korean youths to resolutely and mercilessly wipe out the US imperialists and South Korean puppet warmongers, and warned the earth will break if it launches a strike. A spokesperson for the Youth League added, "The large contingents of young people are now waiting for the final order of the headquarters of the revolution, keeping themselves fully combat ready to mercilessly wipe out with 5 million nuclear bombs." The US imperialists should know that the earth will break if invincible nuclear force and the 5 million large contingents of young people equipped with nuclear bombs vent their wrath. They continued, "Upon hearing the news that the US imperialists and South Korean puppet group of traitors are making desperate efforts to hurt the dignity of the DPRK North Korea and bring down its socialist system while openly talking about preemptive attack, 5 million youth vanguard of the DPRK are hardening their will to wipe out the enemies with the surging rages at them." In a show of military prowess, Kim Jong-un's troops launched hundreds of ballistic weapons to mark the 85th anniversary of the Korean People's Army. While the US, who have been building up its navy in the Korea Peninsula, tested a new anti-missile system on Tuesday. The USS Carl Vinson aircraft armada is also now within striking range of the reclusive state and is ready to be used if called upon, according to U.S. Admiral Harry Harris. The Youth League, established by Kim Il-sung, the founder of North Korea, is compulsory for all children between the ages of 7 and 13 and encourages children over 15 into production, construction and military service. The U.S. Defense Secretary Jim Mattis and the U.S. Secretary of State Rex Tillerson released a joint statement which revealed President Donald Trump's strategy to conquer the Hermit Kingdom. The statement said, "We remain prepared to defend ourselves and our allies." The president's approach aims to pressure North Korea into dismantling its nuclear, ballistic missile, and proliferation programs by tightening economic sanctions and pursuing diplomatic measures with our allies and regional partners. The United States is urging Southeast Asian nations to join forces and press North Korea to give up its nuclear and missile programs. U.S. Secretary of State Rex Tillerson's first meeting with all members of the 10-Nation Association of Southeast Asian Nations, ASEAN, also addressed another key regional issue, China's assertive pursuit of territory in the South China Sea, where several ASEAN members have competing claims. Mr. Tillerson warned the U.S. is considering fresh sanctions for North Korea amid fears of war breaking out on the Korean peninsula. He said, "We are preparing additional sanctions if it turns out North Korea's actions warrant additional sanctions." Last week at the United Nations Security Council, Mr. Tillerson called on all UN members to fully implement sanctions on Pyongyang, which has ignored demands to abandon its weapons programs and is working to develop a nuclear missile capable of reaching the U.S. He also called on countries to suspend or downgrade diplomatic ties with Pyongyang, saying it abuses diplomatic privileges to help fund the arms programs. He warned countries that if they did not do so, Washington would sanction foreign firms and people conducting business with North Korea. All ASEAN members, Brunei, Cambodia, Indonesia, Laos, Malaysia, Myanmar, Philippines, Singapore, Thailand and Vietnam, have diplomatic relations with North Korea and 5 have embassies there. The Trump administration wants Southeast Asian countries to crack down on money laundering and smuggling involving North Korea and restrict legal business too, U.S. officials said. U.S. President Donald Trump has been working to persuade China, North Korea's neighbor and only major ally, to also increase pressure on Pyongyang. White House officials say they are also asking China to use its influence with more China-friendly ASEAN members, such as Laos and Cambodia, to persuade them to do the same. U.S. efforts have included a flurry of calls by President Donald Trump at the weekend to the leaders of the Philippines, Thailand and Singapore. Diplomats say U.S. pressure has caused some irritation in ASEAN, including Malaysia, which has maintained relations with Pyongyang in spite of the assassination of North Korean leader Kim Jong-un's estranged half-brother at Kuala Lumpur International Airport on February 13. On the South China Sea, ASEAN has adopted a cautious approach recently towards China, with a weekend summit of its leaders avoiding references to Beijing's building and arming of islands there. Analysts say this reflects concerns among some in the region that former U.S. President Barack Obama's pivot to Asia has been abandoned in favor of Mr. Trump's America First agenda, leading to more countries being pulled into Beijing's orbit. Yesterday Mr. Tillerson outlined to his staff how U.S. foreign policy fitted in with Mr. Trump's isolationist agenda. He said U.S. foreign policy priorities had got a little bit out of balance in the previous decades, with the U.S. too focused on promoting economic activity and trade with emerging economies. He said, "These are really important relationships to us, and they're really important alliances, but we've got to bring them back into balance." Mr. Tillerson also signaled the U.S. would de-emphasize human rights concerns in some of its interactions with other countries, saying that while U.S. values remain constant, its policies can adapt. He said, "If we condition too heavily that others must adopt this value that we've come to over a long history of our own, it really creates obstacles to our ability to advance our national security interests, our economic interests." When talking about North Korea, Mr. Tillerson said the administration is willing to use so-called secondary sanctions to target foreign companies that continue to do business with Pyongyang in contravention of United Nations sanctions. He said the pressure campaign on North Korea is at about dial setting 5 or 6 right now.